At the FCC, we aim to bring you speakers from around the world talking about the topics of the day, and these are speakers from all political persuasions. Now, sometimes, as is the case today, our speaker, or in this case her views, are rather controversial. But as an institution, we welcome the debate that these controversial speakers bring to our club, as we pride ourselves as a politically neutral platform for free speech and free expression. Now, our guest today is Ying Ma. She was born in Guangzhou and immigrated to America at the age of 10. She's currently a senior advisor at Avenue Strategies. It is a Washington, D.C.-based foreign affairs and lobbying firm founded by Corey Lewandowski, President Donald Trump's former campaign manager. Now, during last year's presidential election, she was also the deputy director of a national political organization formed to support Mr. Trump's presidency. Without further ado, here's Ying Ma, and she will explain why she continues to support President Trump. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Juliana, thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the FCC for having me here today. I lived in Hong Kong back in 99, 2000 or so, in that time frame, and I had always wished that I had stayed longer, but since I didn't, every time I come back, I'm always happy to be back, and I'm certainly very glad to be here with you guys today. Now, yesterday, I had a radio interview also talking about President Trump's agenda as well as President Trump's controversies, and the host of my show yesterday said to me, there are very few people in Hong Kong who are prepared to come out and admit that they support Donald Trump. And it actually, at the time, it didn't surprise me, but it certainly made me all the more eager to come here and have this conversation with you all. I will begin just by saying that I support Donald Trump because I am a supporter of the Trump revolution. Now, since Trump has assumed office, there's been a lot of screaming, a lot of shouting, a lot of frothing at the mouth, and that usually characterizes the political discussions that people have about President Trump. Usually, the people frothing at the mouth are people who don't understand Trump, who don't understand why he got elected, who don't know who are the people who got him elected, and who have no idea what the Trump revolution is all about. I find it very helpful to look back in any discussion about Trump to sort of explain to people what he is all about, what his revolution is all about, and what his base is all about. I will start with the date November 4th, 2016. That was the Friday before the election, and I was in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a key battleground state in the last election, and I was there for one of Donald Trump's massive campaign rallies. There were over 10,000 people who packed into that stadium for the rally, and some 7,000 more of them could not get in. Now, America's mainstream media, as well as the Washington political elite, had spent much of the last campaign slandering these rallies as a congregation of dumb and uneducated white people, racists, sexists, homophobes, xenophobes, the great unwashed. Yet tens of thousands of these people kept going to Trump rallies. Some of them went repeatedly. Most of the time, the rallies were like rock concerts without the drugs. And when these Trump supporters cheered for their candidate, it was explosive and it was emotional and it was deeply touching, and it was no different at the rally that I went to in Pennsylvania on that Friday in November. Trump has referred to this movement of his, this movement that he has led and inspired, as the single greatest political phenomenon of his time. Usually he says other people tell him that, but he's quick to remind you of it often. Yet this narcissist, this man who can't stop talking about himself, this man who won't stop talking about himself in front of his supporters, he readily acknowledges, and back during the campaign, he certainly readily acknowledged that he was just their messenger, that the movement was theirs, that he was just their messenger. Of course, he was often very quick to add that he was a very good messenger, but as the messenger of this movement, I think it helps to understand the messages that the American people wanted this very good messenger to send to Washington and to the rest of the country. I would break it down in the following ways. There is the promise of the Trump revolution, there is the policy agenda of the Trump revolution, and there is Trump's distinct personal style. I think the promise of the Trump revolution lies at the heart of Trump's support. It lies at the heart of what he's all about. At its core, the Trump revolution really is about transferring power from Washington, D.C. back to the American people. It is about transferring power back to people who have not voted for a very long time, people who haven't actually voted for a Republican in a very long time, people who felt that they have been left out, who felt that they did not have a voice anymore, that they have been left behind. And these people came out in droves and supported Donald Trump, particularly in the battleground states. Trump promised bold changes. He promised to shake things up. He promised to kick over the table. What that meant was that unlike your usual Republicans, Trump would not just tinker at the edges of Washington's business as usual. He would not tinker at the edges of corruption as usual. And despite his bombast and his personal flaws, his political movement offered respect for ordinary Americans. The media and the political elites have long forgotten or ignored or dismissed. And who are these Americans? Most of you probably have no idea who they are because most of the time nobody tells you who they are. These are Americans who have been branded as racist, xenophobic, and mean-spirited for simply wanting to uphold the rule of law and secure America's borders against illegal immigration. They are Americans who are tired of being lectured by out-of-touch elites about the benefits of free trade when those elites have never known the humiliation of being laid off in their 50s. Americans who are sick of being told that they have no business saying anything about Islam except that it is a religion of peace, even after Islamic terrorists repeatedly slaughter innocents at home and abroad. These ordinary Americans do not speak in pitch-perfect tones, not by any means. I see some people sneering already, and so imagine if I were not somebody with fancy degrees standing here, I am sure I would be laughed out of the room already. These are Americans that the Trump political movement have offered a potent message to, and it is a movement that has offered a reminder that average Americans do not need to and should not have to speak in the same way as Ivy Leaguers, establishment politicians, or the mainstream media in order to have their concerns heard or their wishes taken seriously. Now let's move on to the Trump policy agenda. The Trump policy agenda might not have been long on strategy papers. It certainly was not long on policy memos. But it heavily emphasized something that Americans actually prized quite a bit, which is common sense. In this Trump policy agenda, there's a lot that you guys probably have already heard of. Build the wall, enforce border security. And in that is the implication that Americans, not foreigners, get to decide who enters American land. There is the emphasis on restricting travel from terror-prone countries. Obviously, those executive orders have been tied up in the courts. But again, in that is the implication and the promise that Americans get to defend ourselves against radical Islamic terrorism. There's the promise to repeal Obamacare, the promise to defeat ISIS and radical Islamic terrorism abroad. There's also the promise that there will be no more stupid, endless wars, particularly in the Middle East. Now, let's remember that it took Jeb Bush several tries during the campaign to say that knowing what we know now today, we should not have invaded Iraq in 2003. Trump was not particularly interested in wordsmithing. I think he said right from the very beginning that we do not want any more stupid, endless wars, and that was what the American people liked. and it was what they supported. Part of the policy agenda is also honoring Americans' veterans who were not getting the proper care they deserved from a government bureaucracy that was at times literally killing them with incompetence and delays. There's the promise for tax reform, for regulatory reforms, and of course, for better trade deals. And in this policy agenda, the Trump revolution of 2016 gave Americans the opportunity for reasserting democratic self-governance. Of course, we can never talk about Trump without talking about his personal style. Now, his style is one in which he will stab political correctness and identity politics in the heart again and again, no matter how much Trump haters hate it, and Trump does that simply by being who he is. We keep hearing that Trump is a racist, a sexist, a misogynist, a xenophobe, and Islamophobe. For those of us who support him, we'd like to remind everybody that, in fact, the left is the real hotbed of racism in America. Leftists are the ones who have systematically discriminated against students by race in university admissions. In the United States, they call that affirmative action. Leftists are the ones who insist that every Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, or other people of color play a role as a token to provide a distinctly ethnic or racial perspective, and that perspective is always inherently supposed to be a liberal one, and they call this diversity. The left's politicians and cadres not only pretend that religion has nothing to do with radical Islamic terrorism, they behave as if after every terrorist attack in America, Americans, in fact, are the people who ought to apologize to the Muslim American community. This is their version of religious tolerance. For far too long, instead of fighting back against this disgraceful yet powerful paradigm, people on the right, conservatives, Republicans, have meekly succumbed to its prevalence and insidiousness. The Trump presidency has already shown that it will not serve this paradigm on bended knee, and that was, in many ways, part of his promise. Now, 7 months into the Trump presidency, governing obviously is very different from campaigning. The promise of the Trump presidency, whether it's the policy agenda, whether it's the promise to shake up Washington, all of that is still alive and kicking, but governance obviously has not been smooth sailing. Attempts at healthcare reform have failed thus far. Every day there is high drama involving the president's tweets or off-the-cuff comments. On top of that, there is the Russia investigation, which was inflamed by the president himself, for sure, but the mainstream media certainly has very gleefully provided wall-to-wall coverage, harping on bad news and spinning fake news. There obviously are the missile launches from North Korea, presenting daily reminders of the grave national security threats coming from this part of the world, and reminding us that there are no easy solutions. While it is one thing to go after his opponents aggressively, the president has not had the self-discipline to contain himself from going after his allies. And so he has also gone after his own attorney general, Jeff Sessions. He has gone after his ally in the Senate Majority, Mitch McConnell. Much of that is unnecessary. He has failed to fill numerous political slots. Instead, the unseemly infighting of his administration spills out into the open on a daily basis, distracting from the task of governing or the pursuit of his political and policy agenda. Nevertheless, here are some of the things that the administration has accomplished. On border security, illegal border crossings on the southern border are already down significantly, and it was down by 50% in July compared to the previous year. The administration has threatened to withhold funds from those cities that harbor illegal immigrants, and the president has issued an executive order calling for the hiring of thousands of more border patrol agents so that they can enforce our border security. There is regulatory reform, which is a story that is often not talked about. The man who is in charge of the Office of Management and Budget says that it is the biggest story that nobody is talking about. Yet the administration has taken the first steps to thwarting the stupidity of government excess. It has required government agencies, federal agencies, to identify 2 regulations for elimination before issuing a new one. It has ordered a comprehensive plan for reorganizing the executive branch, including by eliminating unnecessary agencies and calling for the different agencies to improve efficiency, accountability, and effectiveness. There is market reform. The administration has permitted the construction of 2 major oil pipelines, both of which would create many jobs in the United States and would deliver crude oil across the country, but were stalled under the Barack Obama administration. The Trump administration has also moved to reverse Obama-era financial regulations, including what is commonly known as Dodd-Frank, which have been criticized for hampering lending, harming community banks, and stunting economic growth. On trade, the president has ordered his trade officials to investigate China's massive theft of U.S. intellectual property rights, and they formally launched an investigation recently, and bravo to that. The president is currently renegotiating the NAFTA as he promised he would, and he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership as he promised he would. I am personally a free trader, so I am much more skeptical of these actions, but again, this is the president fulfilling his campaign promises. Now, in many ways, the Trump presidency has been a messy affair. He could have done better on many occasions, but there were many in the media as well as in the political establishment who came after him with a political pitchfork. Regardless, the promise of this administration, it remains bright, and as Speaker Newt Gingrich, a very staunch Trump supporter and one of the most articulate explainers of Trump, noted during the campaign, Trump is somebody who has concluded that bureaucracy doesn't work, that political correctness is stupid, and that American interests as a nation deserves to be protected. And nothing in the past 7 months of the Trump presidency indicates that that has changed. For those of us who are his supporters, we remain hopeful that the bold promises of this administration will be fulfilled. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ma. Now, I'm sure many of you did not agree with everything that Ms. Ma has just said. Let me just reiterate that the FCC as an institution does not, as a matter of course, endorse the views of any of our invited guests. Now, before opening the floor to questions from you, we've got plenty of time for that. Let me just kick off by asking you, Ms. Ma, what do you as a minority woman think of the president blaming both sides for the clashes in Charlottesville instead of offering a full-throated condemnation of the white supremacists there?
Sure. I should note that if anybody wants to throw anything, make sure you just aim it this way. It has nothing to do with our host, and so don't throw anything that way. So I've actually written about Charlottesville, and I've talked about it a couple of times since coming to Hong Kong. I think the president could have done much better in his denunciation of the KKK and his denunciation of white supremacists. He could have been much firmer, much more clear. But as we were talking at the table earlier, his style is that he has a tendency to be extremely imprecise. It's how he talks. Now, I think that from his point of view, he thinks that it's incredibly unfair that people do not cover him or people do not give him credit when he has denounced these groups, and he has denounced them repeatedly, not only during the Charlottesville controversy, but also years ago. Trump was on record denouncing David Duke back in a number of years ago when Trump was toying with the idea of running for president under the banner of the Reform Party in the United States. When David Duke provided, David Duke is somebody who is a member of a leader of the KKK in the United States. When David Duke provided an endorsement of Donald Trump during the campaign, Trump, in front of a bunch of people at a press conference, disavowed it. And he disavowed it again on Twitter. And so over the course of his campaign, And over the course of his life, he has repeatedly denounced these groups. And I think he is frustrated that people think that he is some kind of a racist and nobody ever gives him credit for denouncing these groups. I think, however, that as president, a lot of times you will face unfair criticism, and your job is to unite the country and represent people, every stripe of Americans. And so I think he should have put their concerns before his own frustration. Now, with that said, I actually don't have a problem with him also condemning the other side. There is not equal blame, but I don't think that we should be afraid to condemn people who perpetrate violence. I don't think we should be afraid to condemn people who believe that if your views are different from theirs, then they have the right to perpetrate violence against you. And that is the people who showed up on the opposite side of the white supremacists in Charlottesville. These are people who have perpetrated violence on Inauguration Day across the country, at the University of California at Berkeley, and these are massive incidents of violence. I think that just because certain Republicans are afraid to condemn these groups and that Democrats are afraid to condemn these groups does not mean that the president ought to be afraid to do so as well.
Thank you. The gentleman there. Please state your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Joel Lake, and I'm disclosure, I am a member of Democrats Abroad in Hong Kong. But this is not a hostile question. It's a technical question. What would happen if Mr. Trump makes good on his threat not to sign the bill or the action passed by Congress to keep the government open after September? The idea of a government shutdown is unthinkable. So what would happen if he effectively vetoes the action? Is there a way around this? Do you see a solution? Is it maybe to the Supreme Court, or is it removal by Article 25?
Well, the government has been shut down before. You know, I mean, it would not be the first time that the government would be shut down. I think Trump makes a lot of threats, and I think if you read his comments over time, and if you listen to him carefully, he is a man who believes in very drastic opening positions. I think he sees a lot of different things as the opening bid to a negotiation. So how serious is he about shutting down the government? We don't know, but that is part of the effectiveness. You know, he wants people to think that he might actually go through with it because he would like to see government funding for the border wall. I think that much of this is the threat of this is exaggerated. We will find out what happens. I think negotiations will be ongoing, and we'll see.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Chia. I'm a fund manager. I just want to know, Ms. Ma, whether you think Donald Trump will be able to serve out the full term of his presidency. Thank you.
I see no reason why not. I do think that it's not helpful for him to alienate allies in his own party, precisely because there are a lot of people on the other side of the aisle calling for his impeachment, even though there is no good reason for his impeachment. There are no impeachable offenses, but oftentimes these matters are about politics. I think that there are plenty of members of his party who deserve condemnation. Many of them are very spineless. Many of them do not represent the people they claim to represent. Many of them have betrayed the very conservative principles that they claim to represent. However, there are also plenty of people in Mr. Trump's own party who have stood by him or who have maintained uneasy alliances with him. One loyal member of his own cabinet was someone I mentioned earlier, his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. Now, the majority leader in the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, not exactly somebody who is a Trump loyalist, but he is somebody who has stood by the president in a way that the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, has not. And I think that the president needs to do a better job distinguishing between those Republicans who, in fact, hope he will succeed and those people who have taken every opportunity to undermine him.
Thank you. Gentleman in the pink. And then, gentleman on my left. Yes.
My name's Dave Andrews, and I am unaffiliated. From a policy perspective specifically, because you were quite general in your remarks, what is Trump going to do to help the economic situation, the economic prospects of the people who supported him, the grassroots type of people that you mentioned?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually did neglect to mention that I think his appeal as somebody who would be a job creator was a big reason why many of his supporters supported him. I think his pitch to them was that he would bring jobs back, he would negotiate better trade deals, but I think there's one part of it that is often not focused on very much, which is that he is intent on getting rid of cumbersome regulations that have hampered business growth, that have hampered economic growth. He tends not to speak in very detailed terms, but his administration certainly has been working on that, whether it's getting rid of cumbersome energy regulations, as I mentioned earlier, working to reform the cumbersome financial regulations. I think that the fact that we've had a massive stock market rally since he entered office. I think there's a certain amount of confidence in what...
That's not true. That was what happened under Obama. This is untrue.
Hold on a second. I think what happened under Obama was that there was a massive amount of quantitative easing. I think that if you look at what's happening in the United States right now, and you had all kinds of experts predicting that after the Trump election that the stock market would tank. In fact, the opposite would happen, and it's not because of the government flooding the market with a lot of paper money. I think there's a certain amount of confidence that people have placed in the stock market because they feel that this president is supposed to be business friendly. Now, what's in terms of specific policies that he needs to enact, I think a lot more details will have to come out. There's a lot more that his administration would need to do. But certainly, in terms of the executive orders that he has issued, there's certainly evidence that they have actually done a lot to get rid of the many hurdles that stand in the way of entrepreneurship and of business enterprise. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is John Antweiler. I'm retired, but I am an American. I've lived in Hong Kong for many years. My question is, I see a great amount of divisiveness in the Republican Party towards President Trump. I see sort of a wall of resistance from the Democratic Party towards President Trump. I'm wondering if you might have any insights into the efforts that the Trump administration is making towards uniting America, to trying to move forward on an agenda, or is the agenda just too controversial that it cannot draw people together?
I think there is inherently a lot of controversy, and building the wall is controversial. In enforcing the executive orders he has issued on restricting travel from countries that are prone to terrorism, that's controversial. In fact, for a long time under the Obama administration, just using the term radical Islamic terrorism is controversial. I think there's a lot about the Trump agenda and about who he is and what his administration stands for. A lot of that is inherently controversial. And so I'm not surprised that there is pushback, and I'm not surprised that a lot of Republicans have refused to stand by him. I think a lot of Republicans are inherently afraid that they have, and these are people who have promised for many years that they want to do big and bold things, but oftentimes they let their own vanity get in the way. Now, with that said, certainly I think the president can make more of an effort to unite his own party, to unite the divisions, to unite Americans. In terms of his policy agenda, I think there's a fair amount of consensus on the tax reform front. Obviously, we did not see the consensus come through on healthcare reform. We can certainly blame Senator John McCain for denying the president the final vote, but the president is not exactly an innocent bystander in all of this either. So I guess my short answer is that the divisions, the controversies, I think a lot of that is inevitable. We have a guy who was elected to go to Washington to kick over the table to shake things up, and when you do that, there will be a lot of opposition from the other side as well as from your own side, but I think his administration can certainly do a better job to get people to rally around him.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natasha Khan. I'm with the Wall Street Journal. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about a follow-up to the previous question on what Trump's doing for the grassroots voters. So you mentioned getting rid of cumbersome energy regulations and cumbersome financial regulation. You mentioned also that there were some parts of the plan that were neglected. I'm just wondering if there are other sectors that he's specifically targeting, as you mentioned, that his administration is working diligently on that, maybe we are not aware of in terms of specific sectors for his grassroots voters.
For his grassroots voters, I mean, I think for the people, you mean for the people who voted for him in particular, the swing state voters like those in rural Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, those, what we call the Trump, I guess the most prominent group of Trump voters, are those the people you're referring to? I mean, I think for folks like that, I think one of the key things that Trump is most concerned about is keeping jobs in the United States, and he likes to talk about hiring American and buying American, and he likes to try to convince CEOs to keep their manufacturing plants in the United States rather than moving everything offshore. He likes to tout the number of occasions when he's actually talked certain CEOs into staying. Now, that obviously is not sufficient in the long term, and even if the number of jobs saved from those specific conversations are laudable, it's not a massive number. I think that the way he sees his efforts in helping these people, I think trade, negotiating better trade deals is very much one of the things that he thinks is very important.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Mark Vaughn, I'm a fund manager. I want to thank you for your excellent presentation. I thought it was superb. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about the administrative state. For the last sort of 70 or 80 years, there's been a long-term trend across Democratic and Republican administrations to increase the administrative state. It's gotten to a point where I think under the Obama administration, the ratio of federal rules passed relative to congressional statutes was something like 50-1. Utah Senator Mike Lee has an excellent program called the Article I program, trying to get Congress to take its Article I powers more seriously. You mentioned Donald Trump is trying to return government to the people and away from the elites of Washington. Is Trump committed to reducing the administrative state? What has he done, and has he gotten enough attention for that? Thank you.
I don't think he's gotten a whole lot of attention to it. I don't think he himself talks about it that way. The one person on his staff who used to talk about it a lot is somebody who's no longer there, Steve Bannon, his chief strategist who recently left the White House. Now, Bannon used to talk about dismantling the administrative state. Trump doesn't quite talk like that. I'll give you another example. Trump talks about building the wall a lot, and he talks about stemming illegal immigration a lot. To a lot of us, ultimately, that's a question about sovereignty, but sovereignty is not a word that Trump uses very often, and so it's often left up to some of his advisors to convey his messages in a more wonkish way. Now, regarding the administrative state, I mentioned earlier that his administration has been very serious about regulatory reform, and I think the one person who is at the center of that task is Mick Mulvaney, the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And I think in that effort, what we've seen is the effort to cut down on cumbersome regulations, to think about dismantling agencies, to think about eliminating duplicative federal government functions. All of those things, I think that those are not very sexy things to talk about, but I think that actually is one area that this administration has taken quite seriously. Now, with the departure of Steve Bannon, what sort of things will we do on that front? Will we pay less attention to that? I think that's quite likely, because I think that we've lost somebody in the White House who sees this as an urgent priority and who sees this as a goal that this administration should aspire to. And I think that we've lost an ally on that front, but I do think that others still remain in the administration, so we'll see in the coming days and months what more will be done.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front.
Hello, my name's Mark McFarland. I'm an economist. I was going to follow on from the previous question. In 1979, Ronald Reagan was elected on a mandate of reducing the size of government. Ultimately, he wasn't successful. And ultimately, to get re-elected a second time, quite often you have to please the electorate, making the move towards a smaller government easily reversible. How is Donald Trump going to engage that smaller government and keep it a permanent feature?
How is he going to?
How is he going to make it a permanent feature that government gets smaller? Because ultimately that gets reversed whenever you have to go and face the electorate the next general election.
Well, first of all, I would. Let me start with your premise on President Reagan. I think that President Reagan certainly would have liked to have shrunk the government a lot more, but there was quite a bit that he did during his time in government. He was able to push through massive tax cuts and whatnot. Obviously, for those of us who are small government conservatives, we understand that a lot more could have been done, and we wish that a lot more was done. With Trump, I am not so sure that he actually is a small government conservative. I don't think he has ever identified himself as such, and I think perhaps a better way of viewing him is that he's, and I would go back to that quote from Newt Gingrich I used earlier, he is somebody who hates the stupidity of government bureaucracy. And he doesn't like a government that is incompetent. He doesn't like one in which veterans coming home cannot get the health care that they deserve. And so I think his view is he would like a government that is more efficient, a government that is more accountable. But I don't think he sees small government conservatism certainly not the same way that President Ronald Reagan saw it. One example I would put out there is Trump is a president who's very interested in getting some kind of infrastructure package through in Congress, and some of the key allies he probably will have in that effort are Democrats, because Democrats are very concerned about infrastructure. Trump most likely is not interested in doing infrastructure the way that President Obama would have favored, but I think, once again, it kind of shows that he's a different type of Republican. He's not quite the kind of Republican that talks only about private sector funding or small government conservatism. I mean, it's just not in his lingo. I do think that the thing that small government conservatives can look forward to is a president who's interested in cutting waste, cutting fraud, cutting abuse, and being an ally to them on those fronts.
Thank you.
Hi, Ying, thanks. I can see why you would appreciate that President Trump has stuck to his campaign promises, and that you could align yourself with his policies. And I could even buy into the fact that, you may need a controversial character to kind of shake up the political system and make some changes. But in your own mind, is there a line over which he may step, in which you, as a very ardent supporter, will say, okay, enough, I don't support President Trump, the man, anymore?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure there is, and I would. So I would go back. So one thing I thought was very unseemly that happened during his administration was the way he went after his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and I mentioned that earlier. And I think it's unseemly because it is one thing to go after your adversaries, and I do think many of his adversaries have been unfair to him. But you don't go after someone who's been loyal to you for a very long time and someone who did a great deal to help you become president. So it doesn't stop me from supporting the president, but I do think that oftentimes he does things that I don't necessarily support. On the Charlottesville question, and as I said earlier, I've written about this when it happened. I think that he should have done much more to make clear that he is not affiliated and does not support the white supremacist groups. And now that's not because I think people have been fair to him, and I think it also is unfair that people have accused him of pandering to those people as members of his base. I think all of that is unfair, but I also think that it doesn't really matter if it's fair or not. He's the president, and he has a job to do. There are a lot of things I would quibble with him on since he's become president. Does there become a point where I can't support him? Possibly, but I don't really wake up every day asking myself that question, because I think inherently I believe in the promise of this presidency, and I think a lot of times what we have failed to do is that we have failed to be able to distinguish. We have failed, and that was the case during the campaign too, that we've become so intellectually lazy that oftentimes we can't distinguish between someone who's childish, boorish, narcissistic, from someone who's racist or sexist or xenophobic and all. And I think that it actually is very important, particularly for those of us who write articles, who have some kind of public intellectual role, to make those distinctions. And so if Donald Trump does something that is in fact egregious to me, sure, yeah, I can see myself withdrawing my support or not offering the kind of support that I do now. But at the moment, I don't actually see that. Or I'm not seeing an example of that right now.
Hello, my name is Robin Wong, and I'm retired. First of all, congratulate you've given a very persuasive speech, and because I think the very fact that I come here because majority of people I think I know probably do not like Donald Trump very much, right? And obviously you attracts me to come. But one thing is that I want to ask you is that do you think he is a really suitable leader for the world? Is he the kind of leader who will enhance stability? Because a lot of people are worrying about, because of his confrontational style, actually the regional stability or even the fear of a nuclear war. Is he the person with a temperament to really manage that?
Well, I think he has a different perspective of the world, and in fact, that's one of the big reasons of his appeal to the American electorate. I think as a result of the disaster known as the Iraq War under President George W. Bush and the continuation of that disaster under President Barack Obama, Trump promised a very different kind of world leadership under the United States. I think that he felt rightly that the American people were tired of a lot of foreign entanglements, that they were tired of the cost, they were tired of body bags coming home, they were tired of terrorists growing stronger rather than weaker, all of those things. And so I think he is a president who has promised to look at the world differently, not to just rely on all those people from Harvard or Yale or people with their fancy degrees and perfect resumes who have actually brought us one foreign disaster after another. Now, what does that mean in this administration? I think that remains to be seen, and there are all kinds of different strands emerging. He has proven himself to be somebody who can make executive decisions, for instance, with his launch of missile strikes in Syria early in his administration. I think he has proven himself to be someone who is less confrontational on the China front than people expected him to be. He has also proven himself to be someone who cares a lot about the prospect of America winning abroad, because I think even though he is right that Americans are tired of foreign entanglements that bear no fruit, he also knows that Americans would still want strong U.S. leadership. They don't want a United States that goes overseas to lose. And so those are still very general concepts, I think, but I think his temperament as well as his policies have shown us that there are often competing impulses. You know, we saw competing impulses from him in the Afghanistan, in the rollout of his Afghanistan strategy. He himself wanted to get out, but he himself, also under the advice of his senior aides, recognized the possibility of leaving a vacuum behind if America were to just leave Afghanistan. And so I think you will see in his foreign policy that whatever his bombast is displayed on Twitter, that there is very serious discussions and very serious consideration about how to deal with national security challenges to the United States. I think there are some occasions when he actually thinks that a certain amount of his fiery rhetoric unnerves his opponents, and in some cases I think he and his staff are not as opposed to that as his critics in the media. But of course, for those on us on the outside, it's not always clear what's intentionally incendiary and what's unintentionally incendiary. I would note that I think thus far on foreign policy issues, many of his instincts have been quite laudable, but there are a lot of competing impulses, there are a lot of competing factions within his team too, and so we're seeing that kind of infighting playing out as well.
Thank you. Last question.
My name is Angus Forsyth. I'm a lawyer in private practice. In your personal view, is the brouhaha that Robert Mueller is now inquiring into have any basis of fact, or is it just another colossal example of press fake news?
The Russia investigation that Robert Mueller is looking into?
Yes.
I think at this point, because there is an active investigation going on and Mr. Mueller has been appointed and he's in place, he's got his staff in place, there's certainly one can no longer look at it as purely a brouhaha. I think there, you know, when you have a special prosecutor like that, they've got a wide range of powers, and at the moment, we don't quite know exactly what Mueller's team is doing. But no, I think it's something that needs to be taken very seriously. And it looks like the president's people are taking it very seriously, because we have no idea where this is going to go. And the special prosecutor could be on a fishing expedition that could turn up things that are very harmful to the president down the line. We have no idea, but certainly, you know, I don't think anybody should dismiss it.
Contrary to your excellent opening speech at the press, what you just given me is a certain amount of cotton wool. I'm asking for your personal view.
Of whether, are you asking whether I think the Russia investigation is full of crap? Yes. Or, yes, I do.
Thank you very much. Well, on that note, Ying Ma, thank you so much for joining us at the FCC. Here's a little gift for you. You've given us much room, food for thought.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.